Okay, so I'm picking up exactly where I left off in the last video here so you don't get lost. Um, Now what we're going to do is talk about the render settings window. Okay, so I'm just going to skim through that really quick. It's going to be pretty boring, but I just want to go ahead and introduce that to you as quickly and as easily as possible. So let's click on this little icon up here, which is the render settings window. And that opens up, well, the render settings window. And move this here into view. Okay, so what do we have here? Let's go to the first tab here, which is the common tab. And in the common tab, we can change a lot of pretty common parameters, no pun intended. And what we have here is we can change the name of the render. We can change the image format you're going to be rendering out in. So the default is Maya IFF, but we can pick JPEG, Targa, even HDR, even Photoshop document format here, PSD. There's just a lot of formats that we can choose from. I'm going to leave that alone because we're not going to be working with that at all for the duration of this tutorial. You can also change a few things here, say for example render out a single frame, or you can render out an entire animation. We've also got the frame range down here. We can also choose which camera is going to be rendering out. In this case the default is the perspective camera. We can also render out from the front, side, or top views. We're not going to be doing that. Then down here is a more important setting, the image size. We can actually choose from a lot of different presets here, or we can go ahead and put in custom numbers here, so we can put in a custom resolution if the size that you want to go ahead and use is not here in the presets. So I'm just going to leave it at 640 by 480 for the moment. Okay, and then down here, if we see down here, you have render options and it's collapsed. Let's go ahead and expand those options and scroll down, and you notice that we have this enable default light parameter there. It's a very important parameter. Right now it's on by default, and if I move this over to the side and do a render, you see that things render out. And there appears to be this mysterious default lighting coming in from what appears to be the top left of our scene. Okay, every brand new scene in Maya that's created has this default light, this mysterious default light. Okay, to turn it off, simply uncheck that in the render settings, render again, and the default light will no longer affect your scene, which in this case will cause everything to render out pitch black because there's no lights in the scene. So let's turn that back on. Now we can see everything again. Now let's go to the next tab, which is the passes tab. Now passes is not directly related to mental ray. It's not a mental ray feature, it's a Maya feature. So it's outside of the scope of this tutorial, so we won't be talking about passes. That's a whole nother can of worms to get into, and we just don't have the time now to get into it. If we look over here in the features tab, we have some features here of mental ray. We can quickly activate and deactivate specific rendering features. For example, we can turn on ray tracing, which is on by default, or turn it off. We can turn on global illumination or turn it off. We have caustics, final gathering, radiance particles, so on and so forth. We can also turn our shadows on and off very quickly. We have some extra features down here where we can have geometry render out with both faces or just the front or the back, so that can help to optimize your scene. I like to leave it on both just so I don't get any issues later. You'll see what I'm talking about later in this tutorial. And then down here we have a contours menu where we have lots and lots of different options here for doing contour rendering with mental ray inside of Maya. Now we're not going to be doing any contour rendering in this tutorial, so we're not really going to be talking about it, and I'm not going to waste your time talking about it if we're not going to go over it. Now the next tab here is the quality tab. This is a very important tab. We're going to be working with a few parameters here. The main parameters you want to concern yourself with here is the ray trace scanline quality, also known as the anti-aliasing down here, where we can switch from different sampling modes like adaptive sampling, fixed sampling, and custom sampling. Okay, we're going to be working with adaptive sampling, and in some cases we may even want to work with custom sampling. We don't want to work with fixed. What fixed does is if I move this max sample level slider here, you'll notice that the top slider is automatically locked with it and is moving to the same position as the one that I'm sliding down here. This is not a good thing. You do not want to do this. The reason is because right now if the max and the minimum sample levels are set the same, it defeats the purpose of using adaptive sampling, which is one of the key components and features of mental ray. So you never want to use fixed sampling. You want to stick with adaptive sampling or custom, which is just adaptive sampling, only gives you the ability to move the sliders independently. So if I move to adaptive sampling up here and I move the bottom slider, you'll notice the top slider is locked in just like with the fixed sampling. The difference is that the top slider, which is the minimum sample level, stays at least 2 positions behind the max. So if the max is set to 2, the minimum is set to 0, so it's 2 positions behind it. If I move this to 0, the top, or the minimum sample level, moves to -2. So it always tries to stay 2 units away from the max sample level, which is good. That introduces adaptive sampling. If we go to custom sampling, this allows us to customize our sampling any way we want. So we can move the minimum sampling to any position we want, regardless of where the max sample is. So we can set this to 0 and 1, or -2 and 1, whatever we want. So I'll switch back to adaptive sampling, which is the default. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it at 0 and 2 for now. Okay. Down here it'll tell you the number of samples based on which sampling level you choose. So if I choose -1 and 1, it'll tell me that the number of samples will be at least 1 sample per 4 pixels and at most 4 samples per pixel. And if that doesn't really make any sense, don't really worry about it. You don't really have to concern yourself with how it's working under the hood. You just need to know how to use these settings. Basically, the way the settings work is if I lower this down, like so, and I do a render, you notice that the render comes out with these jaggies, as they're known. That's called aliasing. Aliasing is not good because obviously your image is going to look pretty nasty. But if we increase this to say 1 and 3, now I do another render, you notice that the render is taking a little bit longer. But now we get these nice, crisp, smooth edges. This is called anti-aliasing. So we're going against aliasing here, and we're fixing the edges of our image. 1 and 3 is a pretty good setting to use for production use, so keep that in mind. We're going to be leaving it at the default 0 and 2 for now, though we will probably be lowering it once we start working on some of our projects here in Mental Ray. Okay, so moving on here, we have the Rasterizer. We're not going to be working with the Rasterizer. Editor, edit that video. There was a truck in the background. Start again in 3, 2, 1. Moving along here, we have the Rasterizer. We're not going to be working with the Rasterizer in this tutorial, so we're not going to worry about it. Down here we have this multi-pixel filtering. This is the filter that Mental Ray will use. We have a bunch of different options here: a box filter, triangle, Gaussian, Mitchell, and Lankos. The box filter and the triangle are pretty good for doing preview renders. What you want to use for a final production render, I recommend, is using a Mitchell filter or at least a Gaussian filter. Okay, so use the box filter for doing preview renders like this one. And I personally like to use the Mitchell filter when I'm doing a final production render. You also notice that the filter size changes depending on which editor. Edit that out of the video. Edit that out of the video. Start again in 3, 2, 1. So me personally, I like to use the Mitchell filter when I'm doing a final production render. You also notice that we have this filter size parameter here, and it adjusts automatically based on the filter that you choose. So box filter has a filter size of 1, triangle switches to 2, Gaussian 3, Mitchell and Lankos are both 4. You can also change that filter however yourself, so you can come in here and type new values if you'd like. Down here we have ray tracing parameters, and these control the amount of ray tracing rays in your scene for reflections and refractions, as well as shadows and a few other things. So I'm not really going to go over that right now. We'll get to use that in this tutorial later on when it becomes relevant to what we're doing. Then you get to see how that works. Okay. Then we have some other stuff down here for motion blur. We have some frame buffer options down here and so on and so forth. We're not going to go over that now. Then we have an Indirect Lighting tab, and this is probably the most interesting tab out of all the Mental Ray option tabs here in the render settings window. Why is that? That's because the Indirect Lighting tab it houses all of the cool features that make Mental Ray so awesome. Features like final gathering, importance, irradiance particles, caustics, global illumination, and even some cool environment effects that we can do, and we'll be seeing that later in this tutorial. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all of these different things right now because I'm going to be going over that in detail much later. Okay. And then we finally have an options tab here where we can run some diagnostics. So we can see here. We'll see some of these diagnostics later in this tutorial. Okay. And then we have some other custom options down here for performance, as well as for translating some of the things here for mental ray. For example, things like particles and fluids and hair can be translated over so that mental ray can actually render that stuff out, which is of course extremely important. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video here on the render settings. I just wanted to quickly introduce you to these render settings, go over some of the most important ones, and just show you where these render settings are, and familiarize yourself with these render settings here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. That's going to do it for this video. Let's go ahead and leave this here and come back in the next video and continue here with mental ray.